wanted to echo what Miriam and Steve said, and I want to thank you for organising this. This is a very auspicious moment to have a conference of this kind, and I think it's a critical moment in which trying to bring labor questions and urbanisation questions and sort of movement questions together. I have a sort of minor role in trying to facilitate some of that, but I'm no expert at all on what's going on the ground, and so it's a tremendous opportunity for me to listen to people who are close to the action to exactly how people think about the dynamics of the contemporary situation. So I thought what I would do is try to set the stage with some very general remarks rather than try to talk about, well, what's going on with these Swedish Workers' Congress, or what's going on with the New York Washington City Alliance and so on. We can talk about that later on in the day. And I think the comment that started with this statement Warren Buffett made about 2 years ago when he was asked about, well, is there a class war? And he said, sure, it's a class war. And it's my class, not
this rich class is making it, and we're winning. Now, the stunning thing about that is that historically we've had a labour movement in this country that never wants to talk about class war. And they don't want to really get into the dynamics of class struggle. I mean, this seems to me to be a real in-your-face provocation by Warren Buffett, and if you look at what's going on in Wisconsin right now, you must be mad if you think there's no such thing as class war going on. So this, if you like, is something that I think we should really take to heart and not be shy about talking about class war and class struggle and all that goes with it. And it's very peculiar if you start to criticize around that term. The only people who can legitimately talk about class war are the Wall Street Journal and Warren Buffett, and they get away with it. If we talk about it, we're dividing the country and we're doing all kinds of horrible things. So I think there's a discursive kind of question here. And we have to fight some of these discursive battles and find a language. And for me, also, the notion of anti-capitalist struggle also connects to something that I've become more and more concerned about, which is what I call the whole kind of question of organizing for the anti-capitalist transition. Now, when I start to talk about that, people kind of sort of wonder exactly what I mean. So I thought that maybe I'd start with one of the things that I realized in teaching Volume 2 of Capital, which is what's the definition of capital? So what is it that we're anti? And Marx had a very interesting way of putting this. He says, well, okay, there is a money circulation. Is capital money? The answer is no. Because money can only do what money does, which is to facilitate buying and selling. So capital's not money. There is a reason why we might think that making money is what capital is all about, and that's because money is a form of social power which is appropriable by private persons, and that therefore lust for money is very crucial. And the other reason why money appears to be what it's all about is because it's only in the money form that you can tell whether you've made a profit or not. You can't see it in commodity form, you can't see it in production, you can only see it in the money form. But Marx is very clear that to think that money is capital is delusional. And is very explicit about that. He then says, well, some people think buying and selling of labor power is what. But no, actually, buying and selling of labor power and exchange of labor services for money has been going on, you know, many, many times. So it's not the buying and selling of labor power. And by the way, there's a lot of exchange of labor services for money that goes on in our own economy. I mean, if I give a kid in my building some money to walk the dog 3 times a week, then you know, this is an exchange of money for a labor service, but it's not capital. So Marx again says that's not capital. And then he says, well, is the commodity and the commodification form, is that capital? The answer is no, there's been commodification around for ages and ages and ages and ages. So it's not about commodification either. And he even goes as far as to say, well, it's not about production, because production just goes on as production is. So what is capital? And it's very explicit. It's the class relation between capital and labour in production that permits the production of surplus value. Simple as that. So to be anti-capitalist is to be anti the perpetuation of that class relation in production, and antagonistic to that class relation. I think that's a very, very important point, because it then also asks the question, or raises the question, well, what will replace that? And what's very interesting, throughout all of Marx, you will never find him saying state. It's always associated labourers, freely associating in production. Now, what that says is the production process has to be located in relationship to a long, long history within the labour movement, which is about worker control, about worker self-management, about worker self-organisation, about worker cooperatives, and all the rest of it. So the definition of anti-capital, the definition of what a communistic world would look like, is in fact one in which the labour process is governed by associated workers making decisions on their own as to how to organise their own production and so on. And this is actually, I think, a very interesting point to make, because actually, I remember a poll that was made, I don't know, back in the 1970s or 80s, I can't remember, they don't make polls about these things, and the poll kind of asked a simple question: are you in favour of worker self-management? And as I recall it, about 60 or 70% of the population of the United States was in favour, was really in favour of worker self-management. And actually, if you went to the Tea Party and asked them, are you in favour of worker self-management, my guess is about half, at least half of them would be. Which would confuse the hell out of Glenn Beck, because it would turn out that actually half the Tea Party is communistic. So this is the, if you like, so the centre of the project would be to do that. Now, this raises some ancillary questions, because the picture that Marx develops in Volume 2 is the following: that actually money was a necessary condition for the rise of capital, labour markets were a necessary precondition, commodification was a necessary precondition, certain techniques of production were a necessary precondition, and those preconditions allowed then this class relation to erupt and become hegemonic around the world. And the big question is, well, if we displace that class relation by something else, what's the relationship between this long history of seeking worker control? Because we know that worker cooperatives, worker control have been tried many, many times. There's a long, long history. And we know that there's always been great difficulties in making it stick. And we see this in the factory occupations in Argentina, we see it elsewhere. And again, in terms of the popularity, you only have to look at the public reaction to when, you know, the sit-down windows thing that happened in Chicago, and it was very, very positive. In other words, this is a very, very positive imaginary that you can start to promote as being the alternative to the perpetuation of the class relation between capital, labour and production. But it's been very hard to make it stick. In part, it has to do with the way in which the monetary system gets reorganized. I mean, one of the big difficulties that worker self-management has is as soon as you have to go to a bank and ask for some credit, you're likely to find yourself suddenly imprisoned. The same thing happens in kind of supply chains and commodity chains. There's a lot of organization and how to organize exchange of labor services and so on. So there are many issues that arise about revolutionizing those other aspects, so that if you had a world of worker self-management, and those other aspects almost certainly could not be revolutionized without appeal to state power. So it's no accident that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx suggested that the means of credit should be centralized in the hands of the state. I.e., during the last mess-up of the financial system, we should have nationalized the banks and completely taken them over and put them under communal ownership or state ownership or something of that kind. So that is, if you like, one part of the story that needs to be articulated, that an anti-capitalist transition would have to start to look at all of those elements and how we might move from one to the other. But in so doing, there is then the question of, well, what's the compelling reason for thinking about an anti-capitalist transition? And my argument here is, well, not only do you find the idea that there can be an ethical good capitalism is a crazy one, because historically it never comes about, And also, you know, the class war aspect is constantly picking up and all the rest of it. But actually one of the big issues which arises out of the perpetual production of surplus value is that you're committed to perpetual growth. And I made the argument that, you know, the minimum growth rate, which is satisfactory for capitalism, is 3%. Everybody was upset last quarter, the United States only grew by 2.8%. They can't say, this is not enough, you know, we've got to get back to 3%. So 3% compound growth forever is just simply not feasible. It's not feasible for all sorts of reasons. 3% compound growth when capital was about what was going on in Manchester and Birmingham in 1780 is one thing, but 3% compound growth, just look at what's going on in China. If anybody's been to China in over 10 or 15 years, you see an enormous, enormous reconfiguration. And some of it with terrifying environmental implications and consequences. And I'm not attacking the Chinese for this, I'm simply saying, look, if we remain committed to the 3% compound growth syndrome for the next 100 years, this is going to be an enormously, enormously difficult task. And in fact, there are many reasons why I think the last 30 years we've already been encountering certain limits to that compound growth forevermore. And they're not only environmental limits, they're social limits, political limits, and all the rest of it. So for that reason, but there are other couple of reasons why we want to displace capital. Because in the history of capital, there are two things capital does not want to pay for. And there are two things which the capitalists treat as externalities, that is, things which belong out there and somebody else can deal with. One is the environmental costs. They are externalized. They have long been externalized. When the Manchester factory started up in 1780, suddenly all the Pennine peat bogs died within 12 years thereafter. That was an environmental cost which they didn't pay for. So environmental costs gets externalized, and externalities, you know, keep them out there. Now, society occasionally kind of says, well, you can't do that. And so there's a big battle over trying to force capital to internalize the environmental costs. And there's a big battle, in other words, there's a class struggle that goes on over that, a fierce class struggle. The other area that capital does not want to have anything to do with, the cost of social reproduction. Now, Marx puts it this way in Capital. He says, well, what the capitalist does is to give the worker a wage and let them figure out how to actually live and reproduce and do all the things they need to do in order to, you know. So he says that capital's not concerned with that, doesn't want to have anything to do with that. But again, historically, what we've seen are social movements and political movements that have forced capital to start to internalize some of the social costs of social reproduction. In education, healthcare, you know, care for the aged and all the rest of it. And in the 1950s and 1960s, capital was being pushed in that direction, in the advanced capitalist countries at least. And you had this construction of welfare states in Europe, and you had kind of agreements made here, healthcare, you know, and worker contracts and all the rest of it. So there was a partial internalization of some of the costs of social reproduction during the 1950s and 1960s. And what we've seen since the 1970s is a systematic war, if you like. And this is what neoliberalism has really been about, to externalize the costs of social reproduction. To have capital have nothing to do with it, to put it back to where Marx said it was back then in sort of 1860, which is give them the money and then let them worry about, you know, the healthcare, the education, all the costs, all those other kinds of things. And so there's been a systematic attempt to externalize it. And of course, one of the ways in which you do that is to move capital to where those costs have not been internalized anyway, i.e. take them to China. So environmental costs, so costs of social reproduction are not internalized in China, so when General Motors goes to China, it doesn't need to be bothered about any of those kinds of things. So that's, if you like, one of the ways in which you do it. The other thing is to have an assault upon the welfare state, an assault upon the internalization of those costs. So you're turning them into externalities, and that's what capital wants to do. And that's what it systematically pursues. That's what one of its big objectives of playing this class war has been about, externalize those costs. And in both of those spheres right now, both in terms of the environment, which we're going to be discussing today, and also in costs of social reproduction, we see what capital is trying to do. But then the question is, how do they do it? And exactly what means do they do it? And this, I think, is one of the points where we need to be very explicit about the dynamics of what's been happening, particularly in this crisis and its aftermath. Now, there's an interesting kind of point that technically the crisis is declared over, the recession was declared over in June of 2009. But we now have a very interesting situation when you look globally. There was a report came out from the IMF last September, jointly with the ILO, about what's the labor situation. And they found that there was something like, they estimated there was something like 30 million jobs had been lost worldwide during the recession. The 20 million they could really thoroughly document, 7.5 million were lost in the United States, i.e. a third of the job loss was located in the United States. China lost 3 million jobs in 1 year and then regained 3 million jobs the following year. But the United States has not regained its jobs. And actually, if you look at the unemployment crisis, it's centered in certain areas. It's really bad in Spain. It's really bad in the United States and Britain and also some of the, Greece and places like that. But it's not so bad in other places. I mean, actually in the Netherlands, the unemployment rate has hardly budged. In Germany, it hasn't budged. And curiously, emerging economies have not suffered so much job loss as the advanced economies. And even more curious is those countries which are low-income countries have actually gained jobs, in part because capital has gone off to the remotest kinds of regions, and then in fact even out of China into Bangladesh and into Southeast Asia. So the pattern of job losses is highly concentrated here, and therefore the job question here is major. But it's not so pressing in many other parts of the world. It is in Europe, yes, but it's not so pressing elsewhere. Social inequality is oppressive and very important elsewhere, but not, So the job scene here is special. But, we have a tendency in the United States to imagine that we run a World Series in baseball, so if we are in trouble, we imagine the whole of the rest of the world is in trouble, But it's not in the same trouble that we're in. And there's something special about the patterns of unemployment that has occurred. The last two recessions in 1990, 91, 2001, were followed by what are called jobless recoveries. Very important. This one has been followed by a joblessness-creating recovery. And actually, we have this kind of amazing situation where the profit rates of corporations in this country are higher than they've ever been, in part because of the higher rate of exploitation on workers, which has been permitted by the creation of this two-tier kind of labor system, in which, those who are already employed are on one kind of contractual basis, and those who are now newly employed are on another contractual basis, which is much less generous, particularly in terms of benefits and costs of social reproduction, i.e. you're getting rid of the costs of social reproduction. So here you have this situation in the United States. And the other thing that's been very remarkable in the United States is when you look at the joblessness, what you find is that historically there's never been more than about 25% that have been unemployed for more than 6 months. It's now half of the people. In other words, this is again a new situation in the United States. And when you add up the job list and those who are on temporary work and not inadequate and all this kind of stuff, you're in a situation where 1/5 of the people in the United States do not have access to adequate work. 1/5. That is a remarkable figure. 1/5. And that 1/5 is being treated as if they are the problem. It's their fault. And by the way, their cost of social reproduction are their business, not ours. So that is the situation, if you like, that we're looking at very specifically in the United States, and the impacting of that becomes very, very critical. Now, in connection with that, we have this assault of the Wisconsin type, which is going on. And it's not only in the United States, but the same thing is going on in Britain, the same thing is going on in Europe. And the assault is being justified on the grounds of debt and deficit. And here's a very interesting pattern, a historical pattern I draw your attention to. The great Ronald Reagan that everybody kind of thinks is a great Ronald Reagan. I mean, I know you don't, but you know. What did Reagan do? Reagan set up an arms race with the Soviet Union, a vast debt-financed military program. He also cut tax rates on the rich from 70% down to about 30%. And as a result of that, the debt under Reagan soared. Some fiscal conservative he was. In fact, the debt went up. But the real game was given away by David Stockman, his budget director, and he said our plan was to ratchet the debt up to the point where we could then go savage all of the social programs we don't like. That was the Reagan program, along with, you know, attacking the unions and all the rest of it. That was, you know, a program to externalize the cost of social reproduction. Now, what did Bush do? He waged 2 wars of choice. And at the time, if you said they might cost $200 billion, you were laughed out of court, but they've cost $2 trillion. He cut the tax rates on the rich, exactly the way Reagan did. He gave a big gift to big pharmaceutical company, which pays one of the lowest corporate effective tax rates of all sectors in the United States. He gave a big gift to them in the Medicare prescription drug plan. And, oh, lo and behold, the debt goes up. And you know what they said? Dick Cheney was very, very fond of saying, he said again and again and again, he said, Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. He said that many, many times, actually. So the Republicans ran up the deficit, ran up the debt. And now what they're doing is they're saying, oh, this is terrible. We now got to get out of it. How are we going to get out of it? Savage all the social programs. This is the Stockman story all over again. Now, I'm pointing this out to you to say that, you know, people kind of think all these things go on accidentally, you know. And then if you say they're not accidental, people say to you, oh, well, you're on to some conspiracy theory. I say, it's not a conspiracy theory. This is a political project. And it hits you right in the face. Why can't you goddamn see it? And then people say, well, you know, you'd have to think about class and things like that, and I don't like doing that. Well, you kind of go, well, stop it. Think about class and think about, you know, think about what's going on in terms of this fierce political project that's going on, which is a vicious attack. So I'm kind of saying to you that actually, you know, some people kind of say to me, oh, well, neoliberalism's over, isn't it? And I say, no, no, it's going strong, actually. This is endgame of the neoliberal project. We can finally go get. And it's kind of interesting. I had to write an afterword to the Enigma book for the paperback edition that's coming out later. And I was writing it in December, and I was kind of saying, all this austerity chatter and deficit chatter is deliberately, you know, around this kind of question of externalizing the costs of social reproduction. That's what it's about. And absolutely certainly it's going to provoke confrontations with the public sector unions. I mean, it was predictable. So Wisconsin was thoroughly predictable that what was going to happen. It's happening to some degree in Britain as well. And it's also going to hit, and there's also going to be confrontation with those groups in the population who are going to be most hit by the increase in the charges and all the rest of it, i.e. students and various other groups in the population that rely upon some internalization of the costs of social reproduction. So it's thoroughly predictable that this would be the direction in which it's headed. And we're now, if you like, sort of stuck with a simple choice of either fighting it in the terms in which it's actually being hit upon us, or trying to find some neat way to negotiate out of the impasse. But you can't negotiate out of this impasse. And this is one of those interesting historical moments, it seems to me, when the distinctions between reformists and revolutionaries have to disappear. It always is a bit fuzzy. But you've really got to go with what the beast is doing. And you've got to attack the beast. And you can't do that by pretending the beast is a nice cuddly animal but just got a little bit out of control, you know. And you need to clip its nails or something like that because they're clawing into you and you're bleeding all over the place, you know. I mean, you just can't do that. So here we have this situation. And then the big question is, how are we going to organize in relationship to this situation? And and I hope today we're going to be able to talk in more detail about it. My impression from the outside is there's some very good signs and some not so good signs. The good signs, it seems to me, are that, there are more signs within the conventional labor movement that they have to actually sort of face up to what is really going on. And they have to act, and they cannot avoid sort of acting in a class struggle kind of way. I mean, I was reading this book and I came across this thing where there was a story about Andy Stern went to South Africa to teach these South Africans on how to sort of think about the world. And he went there and he came up with this tripartite model of, well, it's capital and labor and the state in alliance with each other around an economic development model. And when he was asked, well, give us a good example of the place where that really is working well, he says, oh, there's some fantastic examples around and the best one is Ireland. Well, what would he say now, about Ireland? I mean, God, what a mess. I mean, the place is kind of absolutely collapsed. So you can't imagine that model's going to work anymore. You really can't. And I think many people in the labor movement are beginning to sort of understand that. And then there are other aspects. I mean, the organization that's going on outside of the labor movement, like the Excluded Workers Congress, I mean, like the domestic workers and like the taxi workers and the restaurant workers and the alliances they're beginning to build with each other, and it looks like it's going to be a very active, dynamic thing. And clearly there is a relationship between them and some of the other institutions that are emerging, like the kind of workers' centers and so on, which are beginning to build. So there are some fantastic organizational forms that are beginning to be pushed. And it's clearly understood, I mean, even I think within the mainstream labor movement, that the National Labor Relations Act is outdated, and one of the best things that could happen is you could be abolished and renegotiated all over again if you want to have that kind of thing at all. And that therefore many of these organizations don't want to call themselves labor organizations anymore, they want to call themselves human rights organizations. I mean, we came across that in the Living Wage campaign in Baltimore. You called yourself a human rights organization. And I remember we went and tried to organize the university, and the president wouldn't talk to us because we were not authorized to speak on the part of the workers because we had not been, we hadn't gone through the NL. We said, we are not a union organization, we are a human rights organization speaking on behalf of the community, and I as a faculty member am speaking on behalf of myself and the faculty when I say we should have a living wage in this, it's a, so yeah, you have to take the tactic, and I think this business of doing that, and the Baltimore Workers United later on did that when they managed to renegotiate wage conditions at the stadiums in Baltimore. So yes, there are new forms bubbling up all over the place. And I think this is therefore very exciting, and conversations need to be had. But these new forms, sometimes it's very hard to keep them kind of in motion. I mean, the Right to the City group in New York, for example, has been pretty quiescent over the last year. And we haven't heard very much from them. It's partly a leadership issue, but I think also, there were issues internally which I'm not really appraised of as to terms of what was going on. And so it's interesting that at least one of the groups in the Right to the City Alliance is also in the Excluded Workers Alliance, and there's sort of overlaps emerging, and one of the hopes I would have is to say, well, is there some way to put both the Right to the City movement and the excluded workers together in a different kind of thing, and see if there are ways in which more of organized labor is going to be absolutely brought into that that configuration. And there are elements of organized labor that are and elements that aren't. I mean, in the living wage campaign, AFSCME supported it, but some of the AFL-CIO in Baltimore didn't. And so, you know, you get these kinds of differentiations historically there, which have, to some degree, to be overcome. And this is, I hope, again, one of the things we will be able to discuss more concretely here with people who know more about it than I do. So this is, as I say, is an exciting moment, and it's a moment where all of that bubbling is going on, but there is an issue of coordination. And there is an issue also of target. And there are many differences that are hard to reconcile, whether you really want to be an anti-capitalist organization or whether you are looking to be, if you like, ameliorative on the particular issues which concern you, and hope that things can be sort of kept a little sort of under control. So given that situation, and given the dynamics of how the crisis has been unfolding, we have, I think, to recognize the specificity of the crisis in this country vis-a-vis what is going on elsewhere. Because if you're, you know, in Brazil right now and you said there's a crisis, they say we're growing at 8%. What are you talking about? If you're in Argentina, they're growing at 8%. Anybody who's connected to the China trade is growing at that. Australia and all the rest of it, they're doing extremely well right now. So there's no crisis in that part of the world in the same way it is here. Employment has been expanding in China. The Chinese sort of situation is going much stronger. There are even, I think, some interesting configurations in this country where the bourgeoisie here is sitting around kind of saying, maybe we should get like China, because at least they know how to grow, and we obviously are not doing very well. And of course, it's a little awkward for the right wing when they kind of say state-led development can't make growth, when actually China's been growing at 10% or more with a state-led project. And of course the Chinese have been launching a Keynesian-type program, not a monetarist kind of program, and it's working, but that is also unstable for a variety of reasons, and so there's this contrast in global politics right now. But I think what we should do is to recognize very clearly that all this stuff about the deficit and all this stuff about the debt, yes, it is important at one level, but it can relatively easily be dealt with by other means. And there was a piece that came over the internet, and I didn't read it very carefully, but it went along the following lines. It kind of said, look, how many billionaires are there in the Fortune, 500 who live in Wisconsin? And what would happen if we actually put upon them an estate tax, And they made some simple calculations, and they said, on that basis, the whole deficit of Wisconsin would be wiped out, simply by a modest estate tax on the billionaires that live in the state. Now, why aren't we taking care of the deficit in that way? Why was it that actually this, the Obama cave-in on the tax, the tax cuts to the rich, which gives, the calculation is something like $370,000 a year to very rich people. Why would you want to do that when you have a deficit and a debt on your hand? But the point here is, again, what we're doing, as Warren Buffett says, is, yeah, my class is waging class war, and we are winning. We are winning hands down. So my recommendation to all of us is we have to act and prove Warren Buffett wrong. That's what we have to do. So thanks very much.
So thank you very much. That was fantastic. We have some time for a few questions and answers, if that's okay. So we just need folks to speak, line up maybe on the side. We can pass the mics around because it is recorded. We want to make sure everyone asks their questions using the microphone so everyone can hear. So we'll have a mic on each side. And so anyone who has a question for Professor Harvey?
Okay. Professor Harvey, do you have any idea how we can gain power over the surplus production? Because that's one of the proposals you have.
Yes. Well, under the social democratic governments that emerged in Europe in the post-war period, a part of the surplus was being taxed away and utilized for social purposes. And actually, we still do have quite a bit of that going on. One of the most intriguing plans, I think, was the what's called the Meidner plan that was launched in Sweden. It never materialized, but the idea was the following: that you would tax corporations and put the money into a worker fund, a worker-controlled fund, which then be reinvested in those corporations. So eventually the worker fund would control the corporation. Very nice idea. Very peaceful way to eliminate capital. Of course, the capitalists went crazy, and immediately they started to set up the Nobel Prize so they could give it to people like Friedman and Hayek and everybody else to prove that such a system could never possibly work. But there are ways. I mean, yeah, taxation is the most obvious way. And then the question is, where does the tax go? But I like the idea that it actually would go into, you tax it and it would go into a worker cooperative, which would then become the owners of the corporation eventually. So you could transform the ownership in that way. Now, the big difficulty with, however, in this, as I indicated about worker control, the whole history of worker control, the big difficulty is to prevent, say, those worker-controlled organizations starting to behave like capitalist corporations, which has happened to Mondragon and others in Spain, and that's a big difficulty. But that means that the environment in which they operate at some point or other also has to be radically transformed. So it's not simply a matter of getting hold of the surplus, it's also a matter of making sure that the institutional arrangements and the general way in which power is reconfigured and wealth is reconfigured does not actually lead into a perpetuation of capitalism by other means. That's the problem, if you like, which exists beyond. But actually getting hold of the surplus is not too hard to do. Provided you've got the leverage to impose the taxation which will do it.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm a student here at UCSC studying environmental economics and policy. And it seems very clear to me, having studied the economic situation and the bailout and all these things, that it's directly in response to policy decisions that were made to effectively cut taxes on businesses, which created this deficit. And we know this. Do you have any suggestions of how we can really utilize the technology at hand to make it public, and how to mobilize the young people, the old people, everybody collectively who wants to do something about it, to really start coming up with creative policy and economic solutions to address these issues?
I mean, I don't have any great answer to that. I mean, you're smart kids, and you can go out there and do it. I mean, look, there are all sorts of techniques. I mean, I belong to the sort of Luddite generation. You can't get me to use PowerPoint, and I still firmly believe that power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I know I'm wrong, So, but by the way, I do think you have to be careful about exaggerating some of this stuff. I mean, while I think it was true that the youth movement in Egypt, from everything I read, did indeed use these kinds of things very effectively, and they may have triggered what went on. But when you looked at the people who were in the square, they were not simply, disaffected youths at all. And it turns out, I've been reading some stuff recently, that actually labor unrest in Egypt has been bubbling since around 2001, 2002, even though it was it's illegal, but it's been bubbling along. And I think in the aftermath, of course, what we're beginning to see is a conflict between the military that turns out to be the entrepreneurial class by and large, and the business class, and the workers, which is beginning to sort of polarize a bit. And the other thing that was being critical North Africa has, in the last 30 years, been through several incidents of food riots. And the price of food is, and I don't know how serious this was, but I think that, commodity prices right now are soaring, and food, there's likely to be food riots all over the place. So I don't think it was simply the Twitter and Facebook stuff that was important in the Egyptian case. I mean, it may have triggered it, but on the other hand, the people who came out and said, okay, we're now going for it, it was very significantly, I think, made out of, workers. And again, it's one of those moments when different factions come together in a common purpose. And simply work together. And they got rid of Mubarak, and now the big thing is, well, how are they going to deal with the way in which the military wants to organize the country? So there are all those kinds of questions. But good luck with your organizing.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Helena. I wondered if you could draw out a little more the relationship between capital and political forms, or the relationship with the state. You touched on it when you mentioned the confusion of the Tea Party or the potential of an alliance with the Tea Party. And I feel that you also came close to it when you started talking about human rights as a basis for the labour movement.
Well, again, I think one of the things it's very important to do tactically is if there is a ruling ideology of some kind, you have to acknowledge that and have to work with it and around it and through it. There was a big study by the American Political Science Association on political attitudes in the United States. And it looked at polling data going back to the 1930s, and then they did a lot of their own polling data. And a summary little book came out of it called kind of a Class Struggle, ? And one of the things they pointed out was, I thought, very interesting. And it was an interesting thing to ruminate on. They pointed out that most Americans are very attracted to the idea of a basic egalitarianism. And egalitarianism is therefore a very important value here. But then the other thing Americans are not attracted to is state power. And I think when you look at the whole healthcare debate, it wasn't as if the Republican Party ever took the position that they were against equal access to healthcare. Not at all. Not at all. They would never dare say that, because you'd then be against the egalitarian principle. What they did say was, we don't want the state to have anything to do with it and getting into your lives. So anti-statism is the way you go. All right? And therefore, and that's the sort of heart of the Tea Party kind of rhetoric is the anti-state, collapse the state and all the rest of it. So, but that's something which is very specific to the United States. It's part of what you might call the American ideology. It's very specific to the United States. This is not the sort of way in which, say, people in Germany would view the state, or people in France would view the state. It's not at all. So it's very different political attitudes. So in political mobilizing and articulating political objectives in this country, it seems to me you always have to be very careful about invoking, the importance of, if you can possibly go around it, which is why I like this notion of, well, it's associated workers, not the state, who should be involved but I think that's good anyway. And of course, it's something that's very appealing. If you're Argentina and places like that, there's a lot of sympathy for that sort of view. And not necessarily wanting to have state power, except that the state has to set up some sort of protections for the forms of common ownership or common property and so on, in the same way that it sets up protections for private property. It has to do that for common property. So there is a very important role for state power to play. But I think that politically we need to downplay somehow or other, well, it's all going to be organized through the state, and kind of say the state has to play a supportive role to what popular sort of worker self-management is going to be about, and the same thing would apply to cities and urbanization. And I kind of think this is a thing, and I was going to sort of read something which I was very impressed with when I was reading the book by Bill Fletcher and Fernando Gapassin. Which is about solidarity divided, and he's talking about current trade union practices, and he wants to set up they want to set up a different kind of set of current trade union practices through forming alliances and taking political action. And these political practice has the following central premise: if class struggle is not restricted to the workplace, then neither should unions be. The strategic conclusion is that unions must think in terms of organizing cities rather than simply organizing workplaces or industries. And organizing cities is possible only if unions work with allies in metropolitan social political blocs. They then ask the question, how then does one organize a city? And I think that's, but historically, again, politically, I'm too attracted, I think, to the whole kind of history of the Paris Commune. But then when you look historically, you look at things like the Tucumán uprising, you look at the Seattle General Strike, you look at all of those kinds of historical moments when indeed the city was organized through labor practices. And I don't think it's unfeasible, and actually in a funny kind of way, I think that's what you're seeing in Madison right now. You're seeing the city being reorganized around a political struggle with the unions at the center. So I don't think that's an unfeasible way to go. And again, this is one of those moments when we can actually appeal to that history of both worker self-management, but also sort of organizing cities in this kind of way, and say, is there some sort of general imaginary in which we can imagine putting that together? And I think that, again, there are two barriers, it seems to me, to real political organizing right now. One is the imaginary, and I know this is kind of sounds a bit idealist or something like that, but if you can't imagine an alternative, then you're stymied. So we have to actually liberate the imaginary. But the other thing that has to happen is we also have to eliminate fear. And I think that one of the things that was so startling about Cairo was that people suddenly lost their fear. And historically, that's always been incredibly important. And, somebody was saying to me the other day about one of the genius features of Martin Luther King was he could go into a room and he could suck fear out of the room. And people would then be prepared to go out and do things. And you saw that in Cairo, and you see it historically. And liberating the imaginary and overcoming fear is absolutely crucial in the processes of class struggle. And those, for me, are the two most important issues I think that we need to take with us whenever we're engaging in political practices.